Fearful Symmetry, Fridays, number 3. A pure God is no God. I thought this was kind of interesting, given how much trouble Jordan Peterson has in answering the God question, as I kind of covered in a couple of other videos. This is going to touch on a little bit of what Northrop Frye says in Fearful Symmetry. And the first thing that struck me was the genius of Christianity in this little section of the book. And some of the points raised that you should think about as I read it is the old man in the sky conception of God actually so ridiculous? In some ways it is, but in other ways it isn't, and he gets into that here. I'm going to do the bullet point part in a second. When we try to go beyond human, we inevitably fall far below. So when you try to think of that which is stronger than man, you might say the tiger. That which can see farther is the eagle. And in every component part of man, there's some kind of beast that can do something better, except perhaps imagine. And so Blake's point and Frye's point is that there is nothing higher than man. And I think one of the interesting things in Christianity is that in the gospel we hear that in the beginning there was the Word, and we kind of know that to be Jesus Christ, the Logos, and that was fully God and fully man in all eternity. It's quite the puzzle, but it's also quite interesting, and it gives an escape route to a problem that non-Christian religions kind of fall into, which I'll get into in a second. So back to the old man in the sky thing. If you try to love a cloud god, it's really hard to love clouds. But now imagine a man in the clouds. And this is, I think, Blake's and Frye's point, that it's easier to have a relationship with a god that is a human being. You can't have a relationship with a mountain or a tree or bugs or animals, to some extent animals, but obviously not the same. I guess you could see a gradation from inanimate objects to animals, creatures like us, to actual creatures like us, like a human being. There's a spectrum of relatability. And so the literal man in the sky is not the emphasis here. It's the humanity of God that's the emphasis. So non-Christian religions kind of fall into a trap that we're going to see laid out here by Blake and Frye, of having this perfect God. And it's often the monotheistic religions that have to fall into this philosophical trap, because they have to reason their way to God, sort of in a Greek tradition. And so you have this objective reasoning out here. And people like Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine and stuff, they're trying to grapple with the other way of attaining truth, which is staying true to something. In the Hebrew way is staying faithful to a proposition, like the covenant. Staying faithful to the covenant was the Hebrew kind of idea of truth, and there was a Greek idea of truth, that it's somewhere out here and we're going to conform our reasoning mind to it. And by doing that, they have to mold God into a certain philosophical, rational being. And it gets to a ridiculous point, which Frye points to in the text, which I will get to. Another thing, a couple more bullet points, according to Blake. We perceive as God, we do not perceive God. Perception is creation, according to Blake. Mixing oneself with what's out there, I think, is what Jordan Peterson gets to, that we have our own possibilities in our head, our hopes, dreams, intuitions, and potentials, and we meet the world halfway, and that is perception as creation. That the tree stump is not just a tree stump. If I'm looking for a seat, then it becomes a chair. God cannot be created in this way, so God cannot be directly perceived. We may see the divine aspect in great men, that is, the divine recognizing itself. We can perceive nothing higher than man, so nothing higher can exist, and I would add, for us as perceiving beings. If perfection is to mean anything, it can only mean the full development of one's imagination. Beyond that, everything becomes a no thing, a negative relation, negative communion. And the text is going to get into this more so than I can here, but I'm just going to put up the bullet points that you can see while I read it. Abstract thinkers scoff at the full development of imagination. They must extract qualities from things. Perfection only lies in the completeness with which a quality is abstracted, read subtracted, from a real thing. Taken to this logical conclusion, the God of pure qualities, such as goodness, etc., ends up being infinite, inscrutable, incomprehensible. All of these things are negative relations. Negative communion with undefined ineffability is its highest development. So now I tried to find this text online, and part of it is blocked. Let's see, the first part is here. I think I have to go to my book for the second part at some point. So there are two corollaries of this. One is that we perceive as God. We do not perceive God. No man hath seen God at any time, because true perception is creation, and God cannot be created. We may see the divine aspect of great men, but when we do, the divine in us recognizes itself. The other is that as we cannot perceive anything higher than a man, nothing higher than man can exist. The artist proves this by the fact that he can paint God only as a man, though if he is reproducing senile and epicene ideas of God, he will paint an enfeebled old man out of compliment to them. But there is no form of life superior to our own, and the acceptance of Jesus as the fullness of both God and man entails the rejection of all attributes of divinity which are not human. Man can have no idea of anything greater than man, as a cup cannot contain more than its capaciousness. But God is a man, not because he is so perceived by man, but because he is the creator of man. Now for the second part of the reading, I have to mix between my book and what I found online, because they block most of the book online, and I didn't buy a digital copy. I stick mostly to hard copies. Thus we find ourselves unable to conceive of anything superhuman in the direction of either design or power. The same thing happens when we try to conceive a perfect God. Perfection, when it means anything, means the full development of all one's imagination. This is what Jesus meant when he said, "Be ye therefore perfect." But many timid abstract thinkers feel that this is irreverent, and that perfection lies in the completeness with which a quality is abstracted from a real thing. God is thus thought to be pure goodness. Such a God could never have created Falstaff, to whom he would be vastly inferior. If this idea of pure perfection is pressed a little further, it dissolves in negatives, as all abstract ideas do. God is infinite, inscrutable, incomprehensible, all negative words, and a negative communion with some undefined ineffability is its highest development. What Blake thinks of this has been put into one of his most brilliant epigrams, in which I can switch to the more easily read digital version, and you can see it as well here. God appears, and God is light, to those poor souls who dwell in night, but does a human form display to those who dwell in realms of day. It is an old quibble that God cannot move, because to move is to alter, and to alter would be to lessen his perfection. As long as this means abstract perfection, the argument is unanswerable. A negatively perfect God is not a creator. In the first chapter of Genesis, we read of a god or gods called Elohim, who can be reconciled with a philosophical first cause. So completely is he a god of unconscious and automatic order that he created the sun, moon, and stars, chiefly to provide a calendar for Jewish ritual, and rested on the Sabbath to institute a ceremonial law. In the next chapter, we come across a folklore god named Jehovah, a fussy, scolding, bad-tempered, but kindly deity who orders his disobedient children out of his garden after making clothes for them, who drowns the world in a fit of anger and repeoples it in a fit of remorse. Such a God has much to learn, but he comes far closer to what Jesus meant by a father than the other, and gets a correspondingly higher place in Blake's symbolism. Even when we try to think of the superhuman in terms of intelligence and imagination, we run into difficulties. To be is to be perceived, and we perceive nothing higher than man. The one certain inference from this is that we cannot conceive an essentially superhuman imagination, and when we try to imagine above human nature, we always imagine below it. It has been said that grasshoppers are like gods, and that they are without blood or feeling. Such gods are therefore as much inferior to man as grasshoppers are, or would be if they could exist. We can imagine men who can do things we cannot, who can fly, who perspire instead of excreting food, who converse by intuition instead of words. But these are differences in attributes, not in substance. The latter we cannot imagine. In Blake, there are no characters who represent anything qualitatively superior to man, in the way that a man is superior to a fish. There is no chain of being in Blake, and no trace of any of the creatures invented by those who believe in a chain of being. No gods, no eons, no emanations. In the Gnostic sense, Blake's use of this term is different. No world soul, no angelic intelligence is bound on the spindle of necessity. If they had any intelligence, they would get off it, as man got off the spindle of nature. So again, I think what this passage kind of struck me as the genius of Christianity, and the genius of having a fully embodied God, a God in human form, and why that's so important, and why other religions can kind of get stuck in the philosophical perfectness of God. And once you get into that trap, the perfect God becomes no God. It's all a negative communion, infinite, inscrutable, incomprehensible. And I just found that so profound and so interesting that I thought I might share it here. So if you thought it was also interesting, please like and subscribe. Thank you.